And so our mission, if you heard the Prime Minister saying it, is to build one strong Canadian economy. And we have everything any country on earth would like to have. Obviously, we have the great people, the talent, natural resources, gold.
Of course, we take good note of the comments made by the President, and of course we'll let the Prime Minister continue his negotiations and will not negotiate in public. These has been the answers that I've been giving to every single question since the beginning of the negotiations.
To a deal with the U.S. that maintains any tariffs on Canada?
Okay, so first and foremost, when it comes to the latest declaration from the President in the United States, we have not yet seen an executive order. Of course, our embassy in Washington is following very closely.
Canada is holding strong and will continue to do so together. Well, make no mistake though, this is going to be a day-to-day fight.
He tried to punish a neighbor and instead handed them a strategy. Donald Trump came in swinging with tariffs. Loud, theatrical, decisive. But north of the border, the reaction was quieter. No shouting, no anger, just a plan. Because while the world watched Washington's fireworks, Ottawa was building something far more durable. Ports, plants, pipelines, and partnerships that would change the map. This isn't just another trade dispute. It's the story of how one man's pressure campaign gave his neighbor the incentive to reinvent its economy, and how that decision is now reshaping North America itself. When Trump revived his tariff war, this time targeting autos, aluminum, and defense imports, the stage looked familiar. Rallies, applause, and the familiar line, "We will bring jobs back to America." But in 2025, the stakes were higher. Canada wasn't the same country it had been in 2018. Behind the calm speeches, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly had been quietly rewriting the nation's economic playbook. They called it a simple plan: protect, create, attract. Those three words would soon form the spine of a $5 billion National Resilience Fund. The fund wasn't born from optimism, but from pressure, the kind of pressure that Trump's tariffs created. The logic was simple. If the United States wanted to weaponize economic dependence, then Canada would eliminate it. It began with protection. When Trump's tariffs landed, 25% on Canadian steel and aluminum, with the threat of more on autos, the goal was to force concessions. But instead of retaliating in kind, Ottawa introduced the Strategic Resilience Fund, $5 billion earmarked to strengthen key industries: steel, energy technology, and advanced manufacturing. The new procurement rules came with a simple motto: build your Canada. Every major government project would now prioritize domestic materials and labor. For companies like Aloma Steel in Hamilton or Alouette Engineering in Quebec, this was a lifeline. In Hamilton, the hum of new machinery replaced the silence of the 2018 layoffs. Managers described it as turning pain into purpose. "When they tax us," one said, "we build our own." Canada was no longer pleading for exemptions from Washington. It was rewriting its industrial DNA. Protection, however, was only the first step. The second pillar, creation, went further. Ottawa didn't just want to defend old industries. It wanted to build new ones that no tariff could reach. The government fast-tracked Bill C-5, a reform bill designed to cut red tape around national infrastructure and energy projects. For years, projects like the Darlington Small Modular Reactor in Ontario had stalled in review. Under the new rules, they were reclassified as critical to national resilience, allowing construction to begin immediately if they used domestic materials. The result was billions in private investment, thousands of skilled jobs, and a renewed sense of self-reliance. From coast to coast, projects multiplied. The Port of Montreal received over $600 million to expand its container terminals, reducing dependence on U.S. East Coast routes. In Nova Scotia, the Wind West offshore project turned the Atlantic into a laboratory for clean power, attracting European investors and local engineers alike. Each project fed the same idea: Canada would no longer wait for American markets to dictate its future. But to secure the long term, Ottawa needed the final pillar: attraction. If Trump's America wanted to wall itself off, then Canada would become the open door. Melanie Joly announced a new global talent visa, promising residency within 8 weeks for qualified engineers, scientists, and innovators. At the same time, Canada's pension giant, CPP Investments, began branding the country as the world's safest home for productive capital. The effect was immediate. Tech workers disillusioned by Washington's visa chaos began moving north. Venture capital flowed in from Asia and Europe. Startups in Toronto and Vancouver filled waiting lists instead of job boards. Within months, applications from US-based engineers jumped nearly 50%. Canada had found its advantage in predictability, in calm policy where others offered drama. That doesn't mean the road was smooth. Opposition parties accused the government of overspending and turning industrial policy into politics. They warned that the $5 billion fund could become a sinkhole. Carney countered with data. Export diversification was accelerating, manufacturing jobs were up, and private investment was matching federal funds almost 2-to-1. The argument in Parliament reflected something deeper, a shift in national identity. Canadians were debating not whether they could stand alone, but how far that independence could go. Meanwhile, the American story was starting to fracture. Tariffs meant to protect U.S. jobs were instead raising costs. Auto manufacturers struggled to find affordable Canadian components. Builders in the Midwest delayed projects as steel prices surged. In Ohio, a major parts supplier filed for bankruptcy, citing tariff-driven material shortages. Governors from Michigan and Wisconsin wrote to Washington, warning that the trade war was hurting their own workers. One governor put it bluntly, "We're punishing our own manufacturers more than our competitors." The same echo from 2018 had returned. But this time, Canada was in a position of leverage. While the White House doubled down on its rhetoric, Ottawa signed new partnerships. The most significant was SEIPA, the Southeast Asia Economic Partnership Agreement, giving Canada access to Indonesia's 270 million-strong market. Agricultural exporters that had suffered under U.S. tariff volatility suddenly found new buyers. Soybean and tomato farmers in Ontario, who once depended on cross-border trade, began shipping to Asia instead. What had been a trade blockade became a detour. Exports rebounded, and rural communities that had feared collapse found stability. At the same time, Canada's energy landscape was evolving. In British Columbia, the Powell River Project, a controversial energy export corridor, sparked local protests but also underscored the national debate. The question wasn't whether Canada should reduce reliance on U.S. pipelines, but how to do it responsibly. For the first time in decades, energy independence wasn't just a political slogan. It was an engineering reality. The global consequences were unmistakable. In Seoul and Tokyo, trade officials quietly admitted that the United States' unpredictability was pushing them toward Canadian partnerships. European companies began bidding on Canadian offshore energy contracts. Even within the United States, multinational firms quietly shifted their supply chains northward, hoping to escape their own tariffs. A report from the World Bank later quantified it. American manufacturers had lost roughly $45 billion in productivity since the tariff wave began, while Canadian exports to non-US partners had grown by 12%. The causal loop was now visible for everyone to see. Tariffs raised input costs. Higher costs slowed US manufacturing. Slow production increased domestic political pressure. That pressure forced allies to diversify. And in diversifying, they weakened the very leverage Washington once held. Trump's attempt to coerce had, step by step, produced the opposite of dependence. It had forced Canada to evolve. Through all this, Melanie Joly's calm demeanor became symbolic. Her speech in Parliament, the one where she declared that Canada would respond not with chaos but with construction, circulated online as a rallying cry. Workers quoted it in interviews. Economists dissected it in op-eds. To many Canadians, it captured something they hadn't felt in years: confidence. The world saw the contrast clearly. Trump, the showman, measured power in headlines. Joly and Carney measured it in supply chains, permits, and partnerships. One chased applause, the other built infrastructure. And slowly, that difference began to reshape not just Canada's economy, but its global image. From the ports of Montreal to the labs of Vancouver, from the farms of Saskatchewan to the shipyards in Halifax, the message was the same. Canada was no longer waiting for permission to lead. He thought tariffs would make America stronger. Instead, they made Canada smarter. When the Trump administration doubled down on its trade war strategy, Canadian policymakers realized something fundamental. If Washington wanted to weaponize dependence, Ottawa needed to eliminate it. Behind the calm speeches and polite smiles, the government had already started laying the groundwork for a long-term defense. Not with tanks or missiles, but with factories, ports, and policy. The plan began with protection. The $5 billion Strategic Resilience Fund wasn't a headline grabber when it was announced. But quietly, it changed how Canadian industries functioned. The fund targeted sectors most vulnerable to U.S. pressure, steel, energy technology, and critical manufacturing, and redirected procurement rules toward what officials began calling the BYC framework, Build Your Canada. Under the BYC rules, every government-funded infrastructure or defense project would prioritize Canadian-made materials and suppliers first. That meant companies like Aloma Steel in Hamilton and Alouette Engineering in Quebec suddenly found themselves not just surviving the tariff era, but thriving. At Aloma's factory floor, the rhythm of the machines told a different story than the panic playing out on American financial television. The company had just secured a multi-year contract under the Resilience Fund to supply high-grade steel to new federal energy projects. The manager, a third-generation worker whose father had nearly lost his job during the 2018 tariff crisis, put it simply, "When they tax us, we build our own." That one sentence, spoken on a factory floor in Hamilton, captures the whole story. What began as punishment became motivation. What was meant to divide has instead defined a new era of independence. Because every tariff, every headline, every threat only strengthened the will to build. And as the machines keep running and new projects rise from coast to coast, one truth remains clear. Canada didn't just endure the pressure. It turned it into power.